I am going to be talking about the Oregon Rail Heritage Center and railroading in Oregon. I have been a volunteer at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center for a little around 10 years. I did not have a background in railroading, but I've always been interested in it, and it's been a pleasure learning everything that the Rail Center has to offer and meeting all the wonderful people who volunteer there. So let's get started. The Oregon Rail Heritage Center is a mile or two south of downtown Portland. We have a building that looks like this. So if you're familiar with Portland, the Rail Center is very near the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, OMSI. We're just at the east end of the new transit bridge, the Tillamook Crossing. And we're located very conveniently for transit. Now, the things that we are most famous for are 3 steam locomotives that were donated to the city of Portland in 1958. The city at that time told the railroads that if they would donate a steam locomotive to the city would pledge to build a transportation museum to house them. Well, the city never made good on that promise, as you might expect. But we did get these 3 steam locomotives that are now at our center. The most well-known of the steam locomotives is the Southern Pacific 4449. I'm sure nearly all of you are familiar with this locomotive. It's a northern type 484, weighs 430 plus tons. It was built in May of 1941 and designed to pull heavy passenger trains from Los Angeles to San Francisco and back. And it's called the Daylight because it did that during daylight hours, primarily left each city at about 8 o'clock in the morning and got into the other city about 6 at night. And the entire consist was painted in these Southern Pacific colors. Was quite a beautiful consist if you've ever seen color photos of it. So our second locomotive that we have at the museum is the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle 700. This locomotive actually is slightly heavier by about 10 tons than the 4449, but it's very similar in size and very similar in power. It's a Northern 484 as well. And it pulled passenger trains between Portland and Seattle, or Portland and Spokane. And it was one of the locomotives that pulled the Empire Builder train, at least as far as Spokane. It ran on the north bank of the Columbia River primarily, and then on into Spokane and back, and then across into Portland. It is it's a very powerful locomotive and pretty much equal to the 4449. Though the 4449 has 80-inch drivers, whereas these drivers are about 3 inches smaller. And this has a boiler pressure a little bit less than the 300 pounds of the 4449. Now, in all of my reading, I have never found a steam locomotive that had a boiler pressure higher than that. And wheels bigger than that. So the 4449 is about as big as it got for a passenger locomotive. So the third steam locomotive donated to the city of Portland in 1958 was the Oregon Railroad and Navigation 197. And the 197 is a smaller locomotive. It's about half the size of the other two, and it's not in running condition. It was built in 1905. So it ran for about, it operated for about 50 years and was donated to the city. We pride ourselves in having operating equipment at the Oregon Rail Heritage Center. And so this is one locomotive. I'll talk a little bit more about its restoration. But this is one that has not been in operating condition since the time it last ran in the 1950s. So we do most of our work on our locomotives through our many dozens of volunteers. And here are volunteers beginning actually in this, no, I think in this case, they're finishing up putting in the superheaters into the ORNN 700. No, I'm sorry, the SPNS 700. And that 15-year restoration is just about complete right now. They started before COVID, and it's taken a long time for a couple of factors. One is that the crew decided to do everything on the locomotive that needed doing. And so some things that hadn't been done since it was built in 1938 have been done. And COVID intervened, and so that kept volunteers out of the rail center for a while. In addition, we have a problem in that our giant locomotives, the 700 and the 4449, are not able anymore to pull our holiday train that we run between Thanksgiving weekend and Christmas time. And they, in the past, ran on the Oregon Pacific Railroad tracks that are adjacent to our building, south about 3.5, 4 miles. And we discovered that those locomotives were so heavy and their rigid drive wheels were so long that they were damaging the tracks. And so we had a very significant bill the last time we ran the 4449 for our holiday train. So we are no longer using those two locomotives for our Holiday Express. And that has kind of slowed, I think, the interest in getting these back in operating condition somewhat, because we don't have a place where we can run these trains routinely. Now, back to this slide, I always like to point out that we're not just a bunch of guys volunteering here. Linda has been a volunteer, particularly with the 700 crew, for many, many years. And she did most of the forklift driving here for bringing in the superheaters from outside so that they could be put into the flues of the 700. So here's another photo of the superheater arrangement as our guys are getting them in the smoke box of the 700. So we're often asked, where did our volunteers come from? I think most people think that most of our volunteers either had a railroad background or were people who had a background in machinery in some way. Well, Bill Habian here was a physician before he retired. But yet he is one of our very expert machinists, and particularly with the 4449 crew has been active for many years and knows this stuff as well as anybody else. Here he's working on a machine that we rarely use, but did use in this case on some of the turntable parts that I'll talk about later. And you'll see the little blue tape there where we had to remind ourselves what this machine actually did and what those controls were, because we hadn't used it in so long. The other machines in our machine shop do get quite a bit of use. As everybody knows, there is no Home Depot for steam locomotive parts. At least for most of them. So we do a lot of manufacture and refurbishment of parts on our own. And we do shop out some work, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the case of the 197. And for instance, we haven't been able to make superheaters, so we have shopped that out when we've done our 15-year, 1472-day federal boiler work. But we do, if you come down here on any given day, you'll see somebody usually working in the machine shop on something. So as I said, we like to keep our locomotives in operating condition. And so periodically they need to be tested. There are federal requirements for certain kinds of inspections, as you probably know. There's an annual boiler test required. And for the public, even if we can't get them out on the tracks, we do like to steam up now and then. And here we are, Doc, and I think is that Mike, are making sure that the air compressors on the 4449 are in operating shape. So we are open 4 afternoons a week, Thursday through Sunday, 1 to 5 p.m. But even when we're not open, if someone wants to schedule a tour, we usually can accommodate them. And here our volunteer, Dave Larson, is giving a tour to some little kids. And the first thing that usually happens when they come in the building is they are just overawed by the size of these locomotives. So we love to give tours to school groups, nursing home groups, any kind of group that wants to give us a call and arrange something in advance. Now, we also love having special days. In the past, we've had Train Day in May. And I think this photo is of one of our Train Day events, where we bring in some special exhibits. We usually steam up a locomotive. We have a variety of things going on, and we draw a lot of members of the public to these kinds of events. Now this, you may have seen this other places, I'm not sure. This is a group in Portland that does Lego work. And in fact, this is actually an early picture. I mean, their current Lego layout is much bigger and more sophisticated than this. Actually, they have a number of running trains that are built exclusively out of Lego. So this is a very popular exhibit when we're able to get it into the museum. Now, most people in Portland know about the Rail Center because of our holiday train. And we do run trains during good weather times on Saturdays, but our holiday train is really our special event. And we decorate the consist and the locomotive inside and out. Volunteers do all that work. And then we run about a 45-minute round trip down south on the Oregon Pacific Railroad tracks. And it's extremely popular. Most of the rides are sold out. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year, pays a good portion of our bills, and it's a delight for everyone. We had the fire department in or last week actually, and they were very interested in knowing when we were going to run, because they get calls every year from people saying that this part of Portland is on fire because they don't realize that a steam locomotive is operating. So they wanted to know what our schedule was so that they could tell people, no, the east side of Portland is not on fire. That's our holiday train. So I'm going to talk a bit about how we came to be. So here are the locomotives that were donated to the city, sitting in Oaks Park. A couple of the smaller ones went elsewhere, but the three big ones, the ones with the silver smoke boxes, are the ones that ended up in our museum. Now, when the city got these, that's what they did with them, was put them into a park about 3 miles south of where we are now. And they sat there, and nothing happened. And they were to some extent vandalized, but we were also very fortunate that there was a volunteer who came and lubricated at least the 4449 parts during that time, and so kept the locomotive from bearings from becoming seizing up. So in 1974, a group decided that they would like to have a train of historic exhibits go around the United States during the bicentennial celebration of our independence. And they said, well, we needed a steam locomotive. After all, it's going to be an historic train. It needs to be a powerful one because this is a 26-car train. And it needed to be oil fired because locomotive coal wasn't going to be available everywhere that this train went. And they intended it to go in all of the 48 contiguous states. So they came to Portland and saw that the 4449 was in pretty good shape. After all, it had only about 14, 15 years on its boiler. And it had been taken care of to some extent, and it was pulled out of Oaks Park and taken to a roundhouse in Northwest Portland, where a crew led by Doyle McCormick restored the locomotive in 4 or 5 months, got it into operating condition. Which was a remarkable feat when you consider how long it takes us to do just our 15 years today. To get that locomotive into operating condition in such a short time was really a feat. And they did a wonderful job. So it started off in early 1975, pulling a train around the country. And it operated in 38 states. And in the eastern states, it did not pull a train. We found a different locomotive. Stories differ, but the prevailing one is that the 4449 was too big for the bridges and tunnels in the Northeast. And it also didn't operate in Texas because, of course, Texas had to do its own thing. And they operated a different locomotive in Texas, but in the other 38 states, it was the 4449 that ran somewhat short of 25,000 miles on the American Freedom Train. So that plus the other excursions it's done to New Orleans and California and Michigan in the last 20, 30 years makes it I think the most traveled steam locomotive in the United States. So after the American Freedom Train, the locomotive ended up in the roundhouse in the Southern Pacific Brooklyn Yard, which is about a mile or two south of our museum. And about 10 years after the American Freedom Train, the 700 was pulled out by a group from Oaks Park, went into the roundhouse. The 197, about 10 years after that, was pulled out and restoration begun. So those three locomotives ended up in this old roundhouse, which was a pretty good place to work on them, but was not really open to the public. So in fact, I was always curious about what was going on, but I never got there. So here's an aerial view of that roundhouse and turntable associated with it. And you can see just in this lower left part, you can see all these container railroad cars that were designed to carry containers. And this yard was being converted by the now Union Pacific after the merger with Southern Pacific in 1996. The Union Pacific said, well, we want to expand this container yard and we want you guys out so that we can tear down the roundhouse and make it a much bigger yard. So that started the effort to raise the money and build the museum. And even before the museum was started, the holiday train went on in order to raise money. Donations were sought. There was a loan from the city of Portland, which got paid back. So this building was built actually entirely with donations. We opened in September of 2012, big day. And you can see here the 4449 was out. And you can see just above the joint between the cab and the tender that the sign over the door is covered up. Well, that was because it was unveiled a little bit later to show that this is now the Doyle McCormick Engine House. So I want to give a short history of railroads in Oregon. You've all seen this photo, of course, the Transcontinental in May of 1869, completed in Utah. Well, in May of 1869, this was the extent of railroads in Oregon. You took a steamboat up the Columbia River to what is now Cascade Locks. Then you took a short 4-mile railroad around what were rapids on the Columbia River. You got in another steamboat, went up to the Dalles, and then went on a longer railroad around the Dalles and Celilo Falls, and then got on another steamboat. So in May of 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was running all the way across the continent, we had about 18 miles of railroad. This is the Oregon Pony, which still exists. It's still in Cascade Locks, can be seen in a little museum there. And it pulled one of the trains around the rapids. So we had a lot of steamboats at that time. Since most of the population lived along rivers, we really didn't need railroads in the initial period. But as the population expanded away from the rivers, that became railroads became more economic. So in 1883, we finally got a transcontinental that came into Oregon and to Portland. That was the Northern Pacific. In 1884, the Union Pacific connected to the Transcontinental, and in 1887, we finally got the railroad over the Siskiyous to California. And this is a photo of the ceremonial arch that was built to welcome the Northern Pacific in 1883 into downtown Portland. And from the looks of the people there, the train was late, as the trains often are coming into Portland still today. So Oregon Railroad mileage increased rapidly after that. And by 1930, we had over 4,300 miles of railroad. And just like in the rest of the country, many of those railroad lines were abandoned as traffic decreased. And so today we have about 2,400 miles. And here's a map of railroads in our museum, and many of those, and if you notice the ones coming south from the Columbia River in northeastern Oregon, those are all gone, as well as many others. So one of the aspects of railroading in Oregon that most of the public is unaware of is how much railroads figured in the development of the timber industry. And as you probably all know, there were locomotives designed specifically to run into the woods on rough, often temporary track that had tight turns, steep grades. And this Shay, for instance, was one of those such locomotives pulling the logs out of the woods. So today we have running in Oregon, Amtrak, of course, going down to San Francisco and Los Angeles and out on the north bank of the Columbia to Minneapolis and Chicago. Union Pacific is the biggest railroad in Oregon, of course, on the south bank of the Columbia and coming up from California. And the BNSF, which owns most of the trackage in the going up to Bend through the Deschutes River Canyon and across the Columbia. And then the Willamette, or the Pacific, or Portland and Western, which runs down the Willamette Valley, has picked up a lot of the trackage that was abandoned in the valley by other railroads. So let me finish by talking about what is coming to the Rail Heritage Center, such that we call ourselves now a museum on the move. Well, you notice that turntable at the Brooklyn Yard before the container yard was expanded. Well, we rescued the material from the turntable. And here's a picture of the 4449 on that turntable in the Brooklyn Yard. You'll notice that it's actually a little longer than the turntable itself. And so the wheels all fit on the turntable, but the parts of the locomotive hang over on the front and the back. So the turntable is just the right size. This is the bridge on the turntable as it came out of Brooklyn Yard. It was not in particularly good shape. We kind of wondered, how did it support those locomotives for so many years in this shape? Almost all the internal bracing needed to be replaced, which we managed to do. And so this is what it looked like before it was installed. Completely sandblasted, all the internal bracing replaced, repainted, looks terrific. We dug a big hole in the front of our museum, and this is what it looked like. We had a particularly interesting thing in our site, in that our museum is built on what was the biggest lumber manufacturing facility in Oregon, the Inman-Polson Lumber Yard. And what they did was they took all of their wood waste and filled in a ravine. with that wood waste. And you'll see that brown streak around the outer edge there. Well, that's all wood waste. And that wood waste goes down about 100 feet. And that meant that we couldn't build something directly on the ground. We had to drive piles down to solid ground in order to be able to support our building as well as the turntable. Sorry, my computer is a little slow. There we go. So the this is what little work to do to finish the fencing, and it is operational, and it's a big treat to watch it move cars and locomotives around. I think it's going to be a wonderful centerpiece for our museum. Now, I did mention about logging. Well, we have acquired a Shay locomotive. The Oregon Historical Society owned it for many, many years, and it donated it to us recently. We haven't been able to bring it into the building to do a 15-year boiler restoration on it because we've had other things going on in the building. But we hope to be able to bring it in the next several weeks. And that is a relatively minor 15-year restoration on a boiler. We think it needs ultrasound and tube removal, but we think otherwise it's in probably pretty good shape. So we'll hold some of our trains sometime next year. And there's a close-up of the locomotive. Most people who've never seen a Shay are amazed at how it operates with the long drive shaft and the vertical cylinders. And I have never seen a Shay in operation. I've only seen videos, and I know that you often hear it long before you see it. And we're looking forward to running it on our Oregon Pacific Railroad tracks near our museum. And we think it's going to be a big hit. And the other big piece of news is that we have gotten some grant money to restore the 197, finally, after nearly 7 years. And so using both volunteers and contractors, we have started that work. Here's a photo of them actually doing riveting on the muddering of the firebox. The work is progressing. We've actually had to take the cab off to do some of this work, so it actually looks like we're going backwards, but we're not. We're optimistic that it's possible that we will have this locomotive in operating condition to operate our holiday train next year. It weighs about half what our big locomotives do. It has a much shorter wheelbase, so we anticipate it will not do the kind of damage to the track that our bigger locomotives have. Behind this locomotive in this photo, you'll see the number 2 Polson Railroad from our president, Rick Franklin, last couple of years. It's had some issues, including a cracked piston that we have been working on with our volunteers and with people from Rick's own shop. He owns the Albany and Eastern Railroad. It's, I think, now back or very close to being back in operating condition, and we'll pull our holiday train starting Thanksgiving weekend. we would love to be able to give this locomotive back to Rick and run the 197 and the Shay as our locomotives to pull our tourist train.